Hello and welcome to another week, friends. Remember, the work week is a fiction. Monday, doubly so. You can get rid of them if you really want to. This is Social Justice Alchemy. Okay, so I've made it clear that I hate the Republican Party, and I've probably also made it clear why, but I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to keep on reiterating this point because it really needs to sink in that the Republican Party is a worthless, god-awful piece of shit that makes the world a worse place for very nearly everyone. An opinion piece came out in the Washington Post this past week. It's by Paul Waldman, titled, "Why do all these racists keep joining the GOP?" This is clearly a tongue-in-cheek thing. The opening paragraph is, Florida GOP gubernatorial candidate Ron DeSantis has a problem, one he shares with a lot of Republicans these days. For some reason, racists are attracted to his campaign and seem eager to give him money and lend their vocal support. Why does this keep happening to members of the Republican Party who desire nothing but equality and respect for all people? It's a real mystery. And then he goes on to describe some of the problems that DeSantis has dealt with. Most recently, a prominent supporter basically, dropped the N-bomb, called President Obama a expletive deleted, Muslim epithet deleted. The epithet started with an N. But the thing is, as the opinion piece points out, this is something that Republicans have to deal with a lot. They get a lot of support from fervent racists. On multiple occasions, quoting the article again, DeSantis has distanced himself from a prominent supporter who said something racist, or found himself criticized for appearing at an event with people who said racist things, or in one case, said something himself that many people considered racist. He talked about monkeying it up when it comes to electing a black guy. And then DeSantis may have been embroiled in an unusual number of these controversies, but it's what every Republican candidate worries about these days. What if some supporter of mine says something shockingly racist? What if that guy who introduced me at that rally turns out to be a Klansman? What if I get endorsed by some neo-Nazi group? But you know who doesn't have to worry about getting endorsed by neo-Nazis, white nationalists, and racists? People who don't give neo-Nazis, white nationalists, and racists any reason to believe that they share their views. Fucking duh. Okay, I'm glad people are saying it. And in this case, I'm glad that it's a white guy who's saying it. More white people need to stand up and say, the Republican Party is really, really fucking racist. It is the party of, by, and for white supremacy. Unfortunately, Waldman doesn't say that this is deliberate on the part of the Republican Party. He just says that it just so happens to be the case that the Republican Party says and does things that racists really, really like. That their voter suppression laws universally target brown people and not white people. The fact is that the Republican Party is the party of the KKK, and this is deliberate. It has been for 50 years. Richard Nixon ran on the Southern Strategy in 1968. The Republican Party of today is the party created by allying with the goddamn Klan. Their platform is the party of, by, and for white nationalism. It is the party of using the military to build the American empire and using the police to keep people enslaved at home. Their party includes programs that were designed by the fucking Klan. Voter suppression was a Southern strategy. Voter suppression was designed by Southern fascists in order to keep black people from voting. It is a very old thing. It's not new. They just have to work a little bit harder to get around. Oh, wait, no, they don't have to work a little bit harder to get around federal laws preventing voter suppression because the Supreme Court threw that shit out. Because a Supreme Court put in place by the Republican Party threw that shit out. And that little program that the Republicans love to save our failing public schools by getting children out of public schools and into private schools that then use our public funds, the school voucher program, that was developed after we desegregated public schools in an effort to get white children out of integrated schools and into private schools that were allowed to remain segregated. Oh, no, they weren't segregated. No, they were just choosy. They got to be selective about the students they took in, meaning they only took in certain students. They only took in white students. Oh, no, wait, sorry. It's not about taking in white students. It's about taking in Southern Baptists because we're a religious school. It was designed by the KKK, and it's still part of the Republican Party platform. That's why they've been so devoted to destroying public education. The fact is that this serves Christian fascism very, very well because ignorant, uneducated people end up being more religious. But it also serves white nationalism very, very well because it allows them to re-segregate our fucking society. The Republican Party is the KKK. They put on suits instead of hoods, but they're still the fucking KKK. They don't call themselves that anymore. They call themselves white evangelicals. They call themselves young Republicans. They call themselves neoconservatives. They call themselves all sorts of things. But they're still fucking fascists. They're white nationalists. They're racist pieces of shit. They're neo-Nazis, and that's why the KKK and neo-Nazis always come out for them. Paul Waldman, he tried, but he didn't actually say what the actual source of the problem is. It's not accidental. The Republican Party didn't stumble into white nationalism. They deliberately set themselves up that way 50 years ago. That's why Trump was such an upset victory. Because he doesn't have a filter. He's an unapologetic narcissist. He has no shame. He's an utter piece of shit. And so he was able to say things that the Republican voting base has been desperate to say out loud for years, for decades now. The things that they have been punished for saying. The god-awful, racist, hateful shit that they have been wanting to say. Trump was able to say because he didn't care. Because he has no filter. Because he's this... whatever the fuck is wrong with him. He didn't win in spite of being a god-awful piece of shit. He won because he's a god-awful piece of shit. And that's why, during his campaign, hate crimes kept going up and up and up throughout the country, because he was exciting the racist piece of shit base that the Republican Party has been trying to keep a tamper on for the last 40 years. It's why there was a massive spike in hate crimes after he won the election, and it's why hate crimes haven't gone back down since. Because despite the fact that he's been the worst president the United States has ever had, despite the fact that he hasn't accomplished any goddamn thing, despite the fact that he's been the most embattled motherfucker the U.S. has ever seen, he has still been going around holding rallies, spouting off his hateful, bigoted shit, getting people excited, and then they go out and commit hate crimes. He is speaking directly to the base. That's the only people he's speaking to, and they love what they hear. He blew the fucking lid off the Southern strategy. The Southern strategy put in place by Nixon. 1, be racist. 2, don't sound racist. Trump didn't give a shit about Rule 2. He just threw that shit out. Now he's just incredibly fucking racist. The base is loving it, and the Republican Party is having a massive identity crisis. Republican politicians don't know what to do, because they don't think they're racist. They happen to be the voice and face of the racist party, but they didn't realize that because they bought into the lies. They bought into the stuff that the Republican Party has been using as cover as part of Step 2 in the Southern strategy. People who have been raised in the Republican Party don't realize this. They bought into the cover story. And they don't realize that they have a hood on the inside, as it were. So it's good that Paul Waldman is coming out and directly saying the Republican Party is racist. The things they do are racist. And this is why the open, avowed, utterly worthless piece of shit racists keep voting for and running as Republicans. But he needs to talk about how this isn't an accident. The Republicans did this deliberately. The Republican Party is the party of, by, and for racism by design. That's something that needs to be said. Let people know about the history of the Republican Party. Let people know where this came from. Let them know that by supporting the Republican Party, they are the KKK. They are racist as hell. Do not let people get away with thinking that, no, I'm just conservative. No. Now that I had a good long rant, got that out of my system for a couple of minutes, let's move on to a book review. Yep, you heard that right. A book review. It is Battle Cry of Freedom by James M. McPherson. It's a very hefty tome, 900 pages. It covers the Civil War era. It's part of a series of books published by the Oxford History of the United States. There we go. 10 volumes. It's the longest of those books, and it covers the shortest era because it's the Civil War. One of the most intense eras of the United States, and obviously deeply connected to what came before and what went after. The reason I got the book is because it was recommended by a podcast I listened to, Tides of History with Patrick Wyman. He's a historian, and he talks about history in that podcast. He started out alternating between the fall of Rome and early modern history. Eventually, he ran out of Roman stuff to talk about. He'd already covered it in an earlier podcast. And now he just focuses on the early modern era. He bounces around, covers different topics, different times. But they also occasionally have book reviews of their own. And one of the books they recommended was The Battle Cry of Freedom by James McPherson. I went ahead and I picked it up because I've been enjoying the podcast, but also because I recognized McPherson. A book I got way back in the day, back in college, a very short book for a U.S. history class, was also by James McPherson, What They Fought For. It was basically intended to be a very brief, In his introduction to that book, the subject of this small book is carved from research for a larger book tentatively titled Why They Fought. That book will explore the motives of Union and Confederate soldiers for enlisting and fighting in the Civil War. And so what they fought for is a very quick survey of some of the thousands of letters that were written. It was a very, very literate era. It's only 70 pages. It's more of an essay than it is a book, what they fought for is. And it covers the motivations and beliefs and thoughts and so on of various of the soldiers in the Union and Confederate armies. Battle Cry of Freedom, is it's a much more thorough book. But I am enjoying the hell out of it. I'm only 150 pages in, so not very far. I mean, like I said, it's 800 or 900 pages all told. It's very long. 150 pages, I'm still in the 1850s. But I definitely recommend Battle Cry of Freedom, just on what I've covered so far, because it makes it clear, just as what they fought for makes it clear. The war was about slavery. That was the defining issue of the era. North and South were thoroughly, entirely, bitterly divided by slavery. And I also recommend What They Fought For, not necessarily a companion piece, maybe even buy it separately. Like I said, it's only 60 pages, a very quick read. But it makes it clear that slavery is what those soldiers were fighting for, what they were fighting about, I should say, not necessarily what they were fighting for. Union soldiers, like I said, I'm only 150 pages into Battle Cry, but I've read What They Fought For in its entirety, all 70 pages. Every soldier on both sides of that conflict knew that the war was about slavery. Union soldiers, he divides them into, of course, Union and Confederate, also into enlisted and officers. Everyone was aware they were fighting because of slavery. And so they had very different reactions to fighting over slavery. Union soldiers, enlisted men at the beginning, mostly didn't care as much about ending slavery. They were going to war to preserve the Union. There were some ardent abolitionists in there, but by and large, they weren't interested in ending slavery. Confederate soldiers were deeply divided. Enlisted men knew they were fighting on behalf of slavery, and they resented the shit out of it because most of them didn't own slaves. Enlisted means poor. Officers also knew they were fighting on behalf of slavery, and they were eager to do so because they were wealthy and owned slaves. So it's a enlightening educational read there. And Battle Cry of Freedom is shaping up in the exact same way. It's covering right now, just covering at the beginning, covering the years leading up to the war. We'll see how he tackles the war itself in the years afterward. I don't know. I'm learning a lot. I did not know that the idea of the middle-class family where the man goes to work and the wife stays home, I thought that was kind of a 1950s thing. It appears to have been an 1830s, 1840s kind of thing. So I've been learning a great deal. It's an era I didn't necessarily know too much about. All I knew was that slavery was the big defining issue. But there was a lot of other things. There were a lot of other things going on at that time. So interesting, informative, and McPherson, a good historian, not like some others I've encountered. All right, so that'll do it for that book review. I recommend both. James McPherson seems to be a hell of a guy, hell of a writer. So go ahead and check that out. Some people say a man is made out of mud. A poor man's made out of muscle and blood. Muscle and blood and skin and bone. A mind that's weak and a back that's strong. You load 16 tons and what do you get? Another day older and deeper in debt. St. Peter, don't you call me, 'cause I can't go. I owe my soul to the company store. If you see me a-comin', you better run and hide. A lot of men didn't and a lot of men died. One fist of iron and the other of steel. If the left one don't get you, then the right one will. You move 16 tons and what do you get? Another day older and deeper in debt. St. Peter, don't you call me, 'cause I can't go. I owe my soul to the company store. I was born one morning when the sun didn't shine. Picked up a shovel and I went to the mine. Moved 16 tons of number 9 coal. The straw boss said, well, bless my soul, you moved 16 tons and what do you get? Another day older and deeper in debt. St. Peter, don't you call me, 'cause I can't go. I owe my soul to the company store. I was born one morning in the driving rain. Fighting and trouble of my little name. I was raised in the canebrake by an old mama hound. Ain't no high-toned woman gonna push me around. You move 16 tons and what do you get? Another day older and deeper in debt. St. Peter, don't you call me, 'cause I can't go. I owe my soul to the company store. Yes, I owe my soul to the company store. Let's move on to the news. So, the first bit of news I really want to talk about this week comes to us from Fight Back. It's a Canadian Marxist news site. They call themselves the Marxist Voice of Labor and Youth. Title, Doug Ford suppresses student protest under the guise of free speech. Now, I've talked about Doug Ford before on this podcast. He's the Premier of Ontario, and he is the Trump of the North. He's a fascist piece of shit. And back at the very end of August, on August 30th, he announced that he would force all universities and colleges in Ontario to enforce a so-called free speech policy. Now, perhaps you are iffy about trusting Marxists, so I went ahead and I tracked down the actual policy coming out of Doug Ford's office. The Ministry of Training, Colleges, and Universities requires every publicly assisted college and university to develop and publicly post its own free speech policy by January 1st, 2019, that meets a minimum standard specified by the government. Now, let's go ahead and check out what will happen if the university doesn't comply with Doug Ford's ideas about free speech. Monitoring compliance down at the bottom of the the edict. The Ministry of Training, Colleges, and Universities intends to direct HEQCO, that's the Higher Education Quality Council of Ontario, to undertake research on campus free speech and to monitor and evaluate system-level progress on the free speech policy. HEQCO would receive, review, and assess each institution's annual report and will provide advice to the minister. This is the big one. This is where it comes down. If institutions fail to comply with government requirements to introduce and report on free speech policies, or if they fail to follow their own policies once implemented, the ministry may respond with reductions to their operating grant funding, proportional to the severity of noncompliance. Yeah, they're going to take away their money. This is, this is typical far right-wing policy. They will punish you if you don't behave the way they want by taking away your funding, rendering you completely incapable of operating. That's what Bush did with his No Child Left Untested programs, and that's what Doug Ford is doing now. Now, I just want to be perfectly clear. Doug Ford is a hypocrite who does not care one bit about free speech. We'll get to that in a little bit. First, what's the actual policy? The policy must apply to faculty, students, staff, management, and guests, and it must meet a minimum standard by including the following. First, a definition of freedom of speech. Second, principles based on the University of Chicago Statement on Principles of Free Expression. Okay, this is me breaking back in. What the hell is the University of Chicago Statement on Principles of Free Expression? Well, this was a shitty, reactionary piece of bullshit put out by the University of Chicago back in the summer of 2012. This was when the right wing's attack on universities, entered its current phase by talking about safe spaces and trigger warnings. That was big on college campuses, as well as deplatforming people. Fuckers like Milo Yiannopoulos and Ann Coulter and other assholes who make the world an unsafe place for brown people and queer people and trans people. So the University of Chicago, well, a bunch of middle-aged and elderly white men, typically wealthy white men from the upper echelons of the school's authority structure, got together and published this little statement that, they tried to brand themselves as leftists, but said this is the meat, buried in the middle. Fundamentally, however, the university is committed to the principle that it may not restrict debate or deliberation because the ideas put forth are thought to be offensive, unwise, immoral, or wrong-headed. It is for the members of the university community to make those judgments for themselves. As a corollary to this commitment, members of the university community must also act in conformity with this principle. Although faculty, students, and staff are free to criticize, contest, and condemn the views expressed on campus, they may not obstruct, disrupt, or otherwise interfere with the freedom of others to express views they reject or even loathe. For members of the university community, as for the university itself, the proper response to ideas they find offensive, unwarranted, and dangerous is not interference, obstruction, nor suppression. It is instead to engage in robust counterspeech that challenges the merits of those ideas and exposes them for what they are. To this end, the university has a solemn responsibility not only to promote a lively and fearless freedom of debate and deliberation, but also to protect that freedom when others attempt to restrict it. As Robert M. Hutchins observed, blah, blah, blah. Fuck Robert M. Hutchins. Robert M. Hutchins was president of the University of Chicago, back in the 1930s, talking about whether it was acceptable to invite a communist onto campus. The thing is, communists don't necessarily make things unsafe for people. Instead, they try to end oppression rather than support and further it. Okay, so the statement on principles, you might have missed it, but what they're saying is you're not allowed to protest speakers. Don't protest these far right-wing bigoted assholes coming on campus. And that's what they're saying over and over and over again. You may criticize, contest, and condemn, but you are not allowed to interfere, not obstruct, not disrupt. No protests is what they were saying. They've been saying that over and over and over again. These rich, white, old men acting possibly on the orders of, or just with the eager agreement from their financial backers. Financial backers, universities are so dependent on their big donors, especially now that assholes like the Koch brothers are, basically buying up economics departments all over the country. But they are very dependent on their big donors, very eager to appease them, and of course, big donors tend to be, they're rich. Thus they tend to be right-wing. But they're saying, no protest, no protest, no protest. And that is what the Doug Ford statement is all about. Universities and colleges should be places for open discussion and free inquiry. These are basically taken directly from the Statement on Principles of Free Expression. The university/college should not attempt to shield students from ideas or opinions they disagree with or find offensive. You're not allowed to stop people from speaking. You're not allowed to do anything to hinder far right-wing assholes from coming on your campus and talking. Now, while members of the university or college are free to criticize and contest views expressed on campus, they may not obstruct or interfere with the freedom of others to express their views. No protest. And of course, speech that violates the law is not allowed. So, Canada has, they have laws about hate speech. So, that's a little sop to pretend. Now look, Doug Ford is a fascist piece of shit. I want to make that absolutely clear. He is not a good guy. He has his staff members drown out reporters asking questions that he doesn't want to answer. Okay, whenever a reporter tries to ask a challenging question, his staffers break out into applause. This motherfucker does not care about free speech, free expression, or anything like that. He is a fascist. This policy is not intended to protect free speech. This policy is intended to protect the freedom of the right to come onto campuses and express their views, and to suppress the left in their attempts to protest. Okay, that is all that this is for. Doug Ford is a piece of shit. You may not like Marxism, but ignore the source. Notice that I barely even mentioned the article beyond the fact that it's what brought this to my attention. Fuck Doug Ford. Fuck the right. Fuck fascists. Let's move on. And now for the good news. From Science Daily. Scientists grow human esophagus in lab. Okay, I gotta be honest. That headline, it caught my attention, and it seems a little bit dishonest, but technically not, so it's the worst kind of dishonest, They didn't actually grow this full esophagus. They grew esophageal tissue. The subheadline, kind of spells that out. Tiny organoids enable personalized disease diagnosis, regenerative therapies. So what they did manage to do, and it is a pretty big deal. It is a big deal, don't get me wrong. They grew esophageal tissue that organized itself into organoids. An organoid being just basically a small section of tissue that self-organizes in the way that the tissue would in the body. So it's able to function the way it should, even though it's just this tiny little piece of tissue. And the summary of the article, really nails the main points, I think. Scientists working to bioengineer the entire human gastrointestinal system in a laboratory now report using pluripotent stem cells to grow human esophageal organoids. This is the first time scientists have been able to grow human esophageal tissue entirely from pluripotent stem cells, which can form any tissue type in the body. So stem cells, they were the hot new thing 15 years ago, right? And they're making big breakthroughs. That's what this is telling us. They were able to get the stem cells, they were able to direct them in the way they wanted there in the petri dish to form this esophageal tissue. No, they didn't grow the entire organ. You wouldn't necessarily expect that. You need a lot more than what we have available, I would think. It takes lots and lots of hormonal and cellular signals in order to, grow an organ. But this is a pretty big deal, not only because it allows us to grow and perform tests on tissue outside the body without having to take biopsies and all that stuff, but it also could potentially allow us to grow and alter tissue outside the body that can then be placed back in the body, that allows us to do disease diagnosis and regenerative therapies. That's what it says right there in the subtitle. Disease diagnosis, meaning that they're able to take a small biopsy and grow significant quantities of tissue, or, regenerative therapies, meaning grow tissue to replace tissue that has been damaged or that needs gene therapies to be replaced with. So, this is a pretty darn big deal. It's not exactly growing a clone in a vat to replace your body as it starts to break down, but it's kind of getting there. This is the sort of thing they've been working on for the last 5 years, and they're making significant steps. Good progress. We are living in the future, and that is a good thing. All right, so that'll do it for another week in Social Justice Alchemy. I've been your alchemist, John Brockman. If you like what I'm doing here, if you like what I'm laying down, then do me a favor, like, share, subscribe, leave positive reviews on iTunes, things like that. If you want to talk back at me, you got a couple of different ways you can do that. You can hunt down my blog. That's surgoshan.blogspot.com. That's surgoshan.blogspot.com. Or you can hunt down the YouTube channel where I also post these things. That's a Social Justice Alchemy YouTube channel. If you're looking for something a little bit more lighthearted, I take part in another podcast. It's a Dungeons and Dragons podcast hosted by my friend Kevin. It's the Dungeons and Debacles podcast, where a group of us are playing a slightly evil party trying maybe just a little bit to destroy the world by unleashing an ancient evil. You can judge for yourself whether or not that's really evil. I think the world happens to be a little bit unjust. Anyway, dungeonsanddebacles.podcast.com. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you again next week.